With Brad still at death's door, we need to go deliver the medicine before we do anything else. But there's no reason why we can't use Steven's murder cart to get back to the security room. No cutscene for once, but we have to be back here soon for the next case. However, we have enough time to double back to North Plaza to deal with a big dude carrying a machete in the hardware store that attentive viewers might remember from a call during the Steven battle. Not that it was scripted to appear then, but it's just typical of Otis's usual timing. Anyway.
Name and rank, soldier! You can't tell me, can you, fella? Oh yeah, I know why. It's because you're Viet Cong. I'm right, aren't I? You are nothing but a filthy communist! You, son, are gonna tell me where the gorilla's hideout is. By the time I'm done beating information out of you, you are gonna be begging for death to come take you away.
As a filthy communist, perhaps this should be the slang I enjoy the most, but when I think about it, it really just makes me a little sad. As leftists, we often focus on the foreign victims of American imperialism, and rightly so, but even as we criticise the bombing runs and regime changes, and see Cliff's grisly display which brings to mind the atrocities of the Contras, we should never forget that the soldier is also a victim of empire. Even if he doesn't lose his life in a military that prioritises trillion-dollar jets over troop transports that aren't wiped out by a single roadside IED, he may well lose his mind, or at least a part of his mental stability. Certainly he will lose his innocence while in his teens and in many ways still a boy. In the 21st century, young men and women are led into killing people they do not know for reasons they don't really understand, by economic need, misguided patriotism, family pride, predatory military recruiters in their schools, but most of all by the cold-hearted logic of the military-industrial complex. In Vietnam, of course, the draft lottery meant the only young men safe were those wealthy enough to go to college, then quickly find a wife to get pregnant, like Dick Cheney and Newt Gingrich, or the sons of old men with connections, like Donald Trump, who played football, tennis and golf at university before being granted a medical exception for bone spurs after graduation, which later disappeared without surgery, Bill Clinton, who arranged to join the officer corps to avoid being cannon fodder before backing out once his lottery number made him safe, and George W. Bush, who secured a coveted place in the Texas National Guard, which then tolerated him failing to appear for duty for months at a time, which may have had something to do with his father being a Texas congressman. All of whom, of course, would eventually send more working-class boys to die and to kill in rich old men's wars. Christian G. Appy's Working Class War states that 80% of the 2.5 million enlisted men and 58,315 men killed were from working-class families. Of course, even the survivors of war can continue to be affected by PTSD off the battlefield. Indeed, the troubled Vietnam veteran has become such a long-standing theme that Cliff is rather passé in some ways, although the anti-American themes of this work make his portrayal somewhat more nuanced. Though his fate is not of his own making, and he is ultimately treated sympathetically, Cliff is mislabeled as a psychopath by the game in the same way as the other boss is. The rough treatment of the mentally ill as deranged murderers by the game perhaps reflects the wider attitude in American society, where cuts to funding in the Reagan era often put unstable people back on the streets. Of course, the cast in general is stereotyped, and ultimately it has to be up to the viewer to decide what they're offended by and what they feel is just a typical writing cliché. In my opinion, the game serves more as an examination of how the mindsets of certain subgroups in society can be exaggerated and twisted by crisis into darker versions of themselves than any real analysis of mental illness one way or another, and this is a kind of satire that I appreciate.
Here. Take this. My granddaughter. She was done in by those damn zombies. When I heard her scream, I just lost it. Everything went white suddenly. The war... It wasn't over. Not for me. It never ended.
Cliff's key gets you into the storage room where you rescue his terrified prisoners and head back to the security room for the next case. With Nam in mind, let's dig into the unlockable outfits and go Rambo for a while.
He's stabilized. He should be fine for now. Are you alright? You have blood on you.
Huh? Oh. Yeah. Must be from that girl I saved.
Girl? Was she hurt?
I offered to help her, but she took off. She was saying something about Santa Cabeza.
Santa Cabeza? I think Dr. Barnaby, you're awake.
Santa Cabeza. I should have known. I thought Santa Cabeza was over and done with. You plan to dispense justice now?
Calm down, Dr. Barnaby. We're only following orders. We have to protect you.
Protect? More like imprison.
Professor, if we're going to protect you, we need to know the truth. All of it. Please. Talk to us.
Fine. I'll just get my information somewhere else. Thank you very much. Maybe if I can track down that woman again.
Of course the US government is here to protect someone who's clearly evil instead of the general public, but I guess that's what Frank is here for. The next case doesn't start for some time, so we can get to save some survivors, from the self-absorbed materialistic skank to the typically Japanese caricature of the typically American morbidly obese guy. There are actually two characters with more meat on their bones than Ronald in the game, but of course they're both psychopaths, while Ronald is just an idiot who refuses to avoid being eaten by zombies unless you sate his hunger first. Soon we meet Sean and the True Eye cult.
The end of the world is upon us. Death itself has overflowed upon the world, defiling us all. The only path to the salvation of the soul is the purging of the tainted blood!
They could be seen as a criticism of fanatical American Christianity, but since he doesn't mention Jesus or the Bible, it seems just as likely that he's a send-up of Japan's own Aum Shinrikyo, which killed 20 people between 1994 and 1995, especially given the game's focus on terrorism. As an aside, to reference back to the analysis of Kent, Frank wasn't even planning to save the girl until Sean saw him just take pictures. What a bastard.
A non-believer in our midst. If we are to achieve salvation, his blood must flow! He must be purged! Spill his blood! The blood of the heretic!
Overall, Sean's just a cartoonishly evil stock villain that introduces some human antagonists to the game, albeit ones that are hardly any smarter than the zombies. Then again, maybe that's an irony in itself. Or Dead Rising could just have awful AI, you decide. He's hardly unrealistic, however, as even without zombies as proof of the apocalypse, thousands of leaders have used the spiritual emptiness of late capitalism to incite their followers to do insane things in the name of some kind of purpose in life, which perhaps explains why there are far more faceless cultists in the game than survivors. Since Sean mysteriously disappears after the cutscene, we'll move on for now to another figure that demands blind obedience.
What have we here? Looks like you lured another man in here, you little whore.
No, I didn't. Please, help me.
Let's see just how shameless you are, you dirty little skank. Say hello to my little friend.
No, not again. Help me!
Officer. Officer, can I talk to you for a minute? I mean, look, what did that woman do? This seems a little like...
Shut your pie hole! If you try to interfere with official police business, I'll start with you before I get to her!
I'd say the themes here are pretty obvious, but there's a lot to love in Joe's portrayal of the fat, control-crazed small-town cop. Even though Frank has a half-dozen psychopath kills at this point, he still seems a little unsure about treading on her clearly deranged toes, which perhaps shows just how deep the culturally programmed deference reaction to the police goes in American society. Joe would hardly be the first lunatic to live out their power fantasies, sexual or otherwise, while hiding behind a badge and a gun. The end of civilization in Willamette removes the need for the usual facade, and she degenerates into complete madness. Joe is, I think, our only homosexual character, although it's also possible she's simply punishing her captives because of some other Freudian complex. Either way, she's portrayed little differently than a man would be in this role, which I suppose is some kind of equality. Perhaps a feminist critique would be that to survive in the hyper-masculine small-town police environment, she has subsumed the attributes of some of her male law enforcement co-workers, including their most depraved impulses towards the domination of women.
Pain. Oh, I'm gonna die. Can't believe a worthless prick like you did me in.
Yet more survivors to save. Wait, how did they even get up there? Our next psychopath could be tackled any time in the first 2 days, but in my mind is most appropriate now, since he symbolises the other side of the pathological coin when it comes to America's forceful ideas about civil protection.
Look, mister, if we're gonna fight these zombies, we need guns!
God, stay back! I trust them damn zombies about as far as I can throw them, but I trust people even less.
Don't shoot! Look, let's talk this over.
You can talk to my 12 gauge! Don't get no closer! I'll blow you all to kingdom come!
Hey, hang on.
Oh, God damn it, I warned you. In a situation like this, I can't afford to trust nobody!
Cletus, because of course his name is Cletus, represents many of the same themes as Stephen did, but is more of a cliche of the gun-toting redneck small businessman. A more explicitly political portrayal, it's easy to imagine the fat, insecure reactionary survivalist glued to his TV watching Fox News. In this case, what I speculated about Stephen is stated explicitly, that Cletus is more scared of the humans than the zombies. Much like Stephen, Cletus is enraged by the thought of encroachment on his private property, or, like most baby boomers, being asked to give up some of what he feels belongs to him just to alleviate the life or death needs of others. It's interesting to note that under Colorado law, Cletus's actions may not even be illegal. You've probably heard of the Castle Doctrine, a set of laws covering about half the states in the Union, which apply standards for lethal self-defense at an absurdly low level, and Colorado has its own variant. A common liberal attack on gun rights is that, far from self-defense, gun nuts stockpile weapons out of some paranoid far-right macho Sylvester Stallone impulse towards cleaning up the streets by gunning down crime, perhaps with a racial component. Certainly, a male Republican is 6 times more likely to own a gun than a female Democrat, but is it really fair to psychoanalyze people this way? Well, you tell me. In 1985, the Colorado bill was dying in the legislature when one jokester quoted, "Go ahead, punk, make my day." This particular line is taken from 1983's crypto-fascist flick Sudden Impact, where Clint Eastwood's renegade cop Dirty Harry foils a ludicrously over-the-top robbery of a small diner by shooting 3 black men. The media loved the title, and lawmakers supporting the Make My Day Act showed off their juvenile machismo. Sometimes blowing dirtballs away is the reasonable thing to do, one stated. The next joke that they should set an annual hunter's bag limit of 10 intruders. Clearly, it doesn't take much prodding for the inner psychosis of many Second Amendment advocates to be revealed, and to see the meagre value placed on human life, especially of the poor, as opposed to material possessions by the middle-class crusaders for property rights. The game takes a quick break now from commenting on gun culture to resume shortly, and so will we. Cletus is one of the harder bosses, and shooting him doesn't do much damage, so the best way to finish him off is with lots of healing items or a strong bladed weapon. Or, if you're feeling cheap, you can use the machine gun from the convict's Humvee.
Damn, mister! Come on now! What are you, crazy? You want guns so bad that y'all are willing to kill for them? Let me go!
Hey!
Please!
Hey, wait!
No! No!
Cluse's ironic statement sort of rings true, since the player doesn't actually save any survivors here, but you do get access to the game's only spawn point for shotguns and sniper rifles, which will be a great help for the next battle.
Hey,
Seems like she doesn't want to talk to Frank much, but since this is a video game, shooting her with a shotgun will help change her mind. Since she has more than 2 cutscenes to get her point across, Isabella's themes are spread a bit more throughout the game, and I'll let them develop a bit more before I comment much on them. Suffice to say, this battle can be challenging without getting your hands on Cletus's weapons first, but the courageous can choose to go in hard with a powerful melee weapon instead. Thankfully, she seems no worse for wear after being brutalized.
wait, I've got to talk to you! You listen to me? I'm not here to hurt you. I just want to talk. Now, what do you know about all this anyway?
Are you a reporter? How much do you already know? Have you called for help?
Hold your horses, babe. I'm the one asking the questions here. What is Santa Cabeza, and how is it connected to all this?
The zombies were created by you, not us. That's what Carlito wants you all to know.
Who?
If you want to interview someone, talk to Carlito. He has all the answers.
You're talking about that guy that took potshots at us with a sniper rifle, aren't you? Take me to him.
No. Not now. He's injured. And in no mood to talk to anyone. I'll bring him to you once he's recovered. I can persuade him. I'm his little sister, after all.
Why should I trust you to bring him to me?
The zombies are a message from Carlito. He wanted people to know.
Fine. Go. When will you be back?
Tonight at midnight. I'm Isabella, by the way. And I promise, I'll come back.
We're finally getting closer to the truth behind the outbreak, which is cool and all, but the real reward for this battle is Isabella's Americana-style bike, flame decals and all, which she just leaves behind. It seems like a slightly ironic choice, but hey, I guess there's no ethical consumption under capitalism anyway, and you could equally argue that wearing jeans makes you a slave to American consumer culture. Speaking of which, I decided to channel Ronald McDonald in my next outfit, and while we wait for Carlito, I went to take care of another allegory for gun culture.
Looks like 72 yards. I can blow his head off clean from here. Can I take a shot, Dad?
Getting a headshot from here's no big deal, Jack. Think you can pull it off, Thomas?
But Daddy, he ain't no zombie. He's just a man.
Thomas! We're doing this to survive. You know that.
Using a firearm for self-defense is our God-given right as Americans, Thomas.
Come on, Thomas, shoot. Shoot him.
Shoot him, Thomas!
Said shoot him. Thomas. Now! What are you waiting for? Do it!
To be honest, I think this is mostly a retread of Cletus's encounter as far as the meaning goes, but it doesn't hurt to drive the point home about America's Second Amendment culture. Here again we see right-wing might makes right survivalists, this time crossed with game hunters complete with fluorescent vests. It's a dark satire on the kind of gun owner who buys a rifle hoping and not fearing that he will have a chance to use it. The game itself sort of neglects them, with no boss music or final cutscene, leading to a somewhat eerily quiet battle set to the upbeat Mall soundtrack. It's certainly no battle with the end, but it's fun to give them a taste of their own medicine against prey that can fight back for once. Their depiction does bring back to mind the Colorado lawmakers' comments earlier about a bag limit on intruders, and they certainly spout the same rhetoric about a right to self-defense as real-life gun rights defenders. Certainly the Make My Day Act doesn't apply to this situation, but as we've a little time to kill, I'd like to look a little more at why I feel it could have applied to Cletus, even though the game itself takes a clear moral position that he's a crazed murderer. It may seem that Cletus is not really in a situation that requires self-defense, but it's actually up to the prosecution to prove that the killer did not fear for their safety. Cletus issued a warning before firing, which is not even required by the law, and it's true that the man he killed was saying he wanted Cletus's guns, which could lead Cletus to believe he was going to commit a crime while trespassing on his property, which serves as justification under the act. Of course, the man was unarmed, but Colorado courts have ruled that an empty hand can be seen as a weapon which justifies lethal self-defense. I'm going off on a tangent somewhat, I know, but I wanted to demonstrate how American gun culture affects lawmaking in practice. This example is of course fictional, but real-life examples in Colorado alone where the shooter was not charged include in 2010, where a man was shot in the face while stealing a trailer from a front yard; in 2012, when a drunken woman was shot and wounded after walking through an unlocked door into the wrong house and then faced trespassing charges; and in 2016, when a 17-year-old boy was shot in the back and killed while leaving a backyard after stealing marijuana from a garage. 33 other states have a stand your ground law, which means lethal force can be used essentially with impunity in public places as well as in the home, such as in the George Zimmerman case. The point I'm trying to make here is that whether you agree with gun control or not, America clearly has a problem with gun violence, legal and illegal, and a twisted understanding of the value of private property. Most of the time, of course, the shooters in these cases are relatively well off and the victims destitute or mentally ill. In many cases, the slain were indeed criminals, which should be dealt with, but I don't believe that individuals should have the right to inflict the death penalty for relatively minor crimes. If you're wondering where I stand on gun control, I think that every leftist should arm themselves where the law allows it, much as the Black Panthers did. Indeed, it would probably be sensible in the long run for the ruling classes to establish gun control in America, just as groups like the NRA had a remarkable change of heart once black people began to exercise their rights. But just because I understand why some call for armed resistance doesn't mean that I think most of the liberal arguments for gun control are wrong. After all, most people who claim to be valiant defenders of freedom only use their Second Amendment right for the protection of their own petty property interests, or to kill animals. There's some interesting dialogue here with Floyd about the commercialization of culture, but I think it basically speaks for itself. There are 4 survivors in the entrance plaza that you can rescue and escort once you defeat the Hall family, and going back to the security room between talking to Isabella and the next case gives you an optional cutscene that I definitely think is worth seeing.
You learn anything new on this end?
Santa Cabeza is a stronghold of the Central American drug trade.
The professor here seems to think that the zombies are a byproduct of these drugs.
So you're telling me, what, that somebody spread a bunch of zombie drugs around Willamette? For what? What would making the dead come to life accomplish?
They're terrorists. Don't try to explain their actions with logic. I've analyzed the drug in question, and I've reported my findings to the government. That must be what set them off. They didn't want to be exposed. I've told you everything I know. Now get me out of here! Call for help and kill those creeps!
Well, it's nice to note Barnaby's side of the story, and there's some illuminating remarks here. Linking the Central American antagonist with the drug trade is a pretty typical move, and I suppose you could see the zombies as a metaphor for mindless junkies stumbling around looking for their next fix, but something doesn't seem right about that explanation. Most interesting is the Doctor's comment about the futility of trying to explain the actions of terrorists with logic. As I've said, this game is a product of the post-9/11 world paradigm, and it certainly shows here. His argument echoes the Bush administration ideology that the terrorists hate us for our freedom and nothing else, and he similarly advocates the eradication of terrorism through force. In reality, the neoconservative point of view is still largely unchallenged in mainstream thought, and the real reasons behind Islamic terrorism are obscured. It's a shame that few real journalists have Frank's courage to talk to the other side and to question the story they're given by the American establishment. After dealing with Ronald's idiotic mutiny, it's about midnight and time to head to our meeting.
Were you bitten?
No, it was Carlito. I tried to talk him into coming, but it was no good. He doesn't trust anyone.
He shot you?
He didn't mean to. He was upset.
Oh, well, I suppose that's understandable. We all lose our tempers sometimes.
I don't know what he'll do next.
Getting Isabella through a dark mall packed with nighttime zombies might seem challenging, but since zombies mostly ignore you while you're carrying a survivor for balance, it's actually a lot harder to keep optional survivor Kindle alive on the way back. Carlito's apology here is pretty hilarious too.
I'm so sorry. I never meant to shoot you. Now I've gone and hurt you. Please, forgive me. Please come back to me. I know you can hear me, Isabella. I'm sorry you had to get wrapped up in all this. But you know I'm right. Come back to me, Isabella. There are still things you need to do. I can't do this without you. Please.
I never meant to shoot you. Now I've gone and hurt you. I wonder if he really thought that was gonna work.
Who is that? Is she hurt?
Yeah. You're looking at the bad guy's sister.
Bad guy? The one who caused all this?
That's right. Her asshole brother caused the zombie outbreak.
His sister? What in the hell is going on here? I mean, does this have anything to do with that announcement earlier?
I don't know much more than you at this point, okay? But he shot her, I can tell you that. And just so you know, that would be the same guy that shot you.
What's he after? What's his ultimate goal?
I don't know. But according to her, his plan isn't over. Not yet.
Fine. Consider her in DHS custody. We'll question her when she wakes up.
I actually kinda like Brad, but trust him to act like he's in charge when he contributed nothing to saving Isabella. When she wakes up, we'll finally get the truth about the zombies and see a big part of the game's moral message, but I think this is a good time to take a break. See you next time for what I really hope will actually be the final installment.